There are incredible things going on in the community. Tremendous amount of activity at the ground level, if you will. We heard some of that yesterday. Today we've got a panel of experts talking about new and innovative programs that are being taken to help people monitor, use, produce, and manage energy differently. Moderating our panel is Commissioner Martha Guzman-Acefes of the California Public Utilities Commission. Martha was appointed by Governor Brown in late 2016 to this assignment. For 5 years prior, she served as Deputy Legislative Affairs Secretary in the Governor's office. Martha's been a leading voice on issues related to natural resources, environmental protection, sustainability, energy, food, and agriculture. In 2010, she co-founded Communities for a New California, a charitable organization promoting increased civic engagement for underrepresented communities. Commissioner, thank you for being here. Please take it away.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for sticking it out and making it through the last panel. We have today the topic, energy in the community, and I wanted to just set a little bit of the table and talk about some of the basic demographics and reference a couple of statewide statistics, just to put it in context. One in this room that's very familiar to most folks in the room are the CARE participation levels, the ratepayer lifeline support for electricity and gas. CARE participation varies by utility, but it's between 20 and 27%. And in some counties, it's as high as 45%. When you look at the federal poverty rates and you adjust them for cost of living, we have the highest poverty level in the nation. 20% of our residents live in poverty, and another 20% live in near poverty. So 40% of our residents are in near poverty. Another statistic, 13 million of Californians out of 39 million Californians are on some sort of Medi-Cal support. That's 33% of Californians. So I just share those so we kind of put it in context that we're not talking about a niche set of customers, we're talking about a third of Californians. We've recognized collectively now, part of the reason we have this panel, is that we've failed to meet this population in directing investments. We have traditionally looked at them for rate subsidy support, but in investment, and particularly in distributed investment, we haven't quite gotten the job right. The state legislature here in California has really directed us to focus on this need. And one particular tool that's utilized across state agencies is the CalEnviroscreen. And this is a tool that the Cal EPA, through OEHA, has developed an indicator of about 20 statewide poverty and pollution indicators. And they have identified the top 25% of Californians in poverty and pollution. And the California PUC has now utilized this tool among other sister agencies like the Air Board and the California Energy Commission to dedicate resources. And you'll see this in our transportation electrification budgets. You've seen it in our storage budgets, and you'll see it in more of our distributed efforts. Okay, one of the questions that we hope to really, the dialogue about today is how we pay for these costs. We will hear examples about generation costs covering some of these projects, about distribution costs covering some of these projects, and also greenhouse gas revenue allocations covering some of these costs. So those are some examples, and we'll hear a little bit more about different options. And another question that we hope to really get into, is there a better provider of these options? We have traditional utilities providing some of these offerings, as we call them. We have now, as we talked about in this last panel, diversity in offerings. We have CCAs who are very involved in these opportunities, and we have third-party providers. So we're gonna ask that question, what's the benefit of these different providers? Okay. I'm gonna start the introductions and then allow each of our speakers to give a little bit of perspective. Dr. Felicia Federico is the Executive Director of the California Center for Sustainable Communities at UCLA, which is within the Institute of Environment and Sustainability. Jeff Sievers, and we really want to thank Jeff for coming today and really support all of the communities that you're working with, and hopefully we're over the hump here and we get some rain tonight. Jeff is the Chief Executive Officer for Sonoma Clean Power. And Judith Schwartz is the President and founder of To The Point. So we're going to go ahead and start with you, Judith, to share some of your perspectives.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to come and be part of this panel. And I'm also, in addition to having a consulting company, To The Point, I'm also a commissioner on the Palo Alto Utility Advisory Commission. So I'm obligated to tell you that what I say today is my opinion and not the opinion of either the UAC or the City of Palo Alto Utility. So among the things that I do in my work is I do research and meta-analyses that look at trends regarding consumer engagement across the country. And one of my recent projects has been a study of community solar for disadvantaged residents. And we looked at sort of what the state of the situation was right now and what people are able to do. And in doing that, there were things that came up that were really important. And one of them was that not all low-income and mid-income people have the same profile or the same issues or the same priorities. And that is true for the entire population. So just as was discussed earlier on the last panel, there are cultural differences between states. I have to tell you, there are cultural differences within every town and community in Palo Alto. Not everybody really cares about this vision for the green future. It's not universal. And when you're talking about low-income communities, you're also dealing with the solvency issue of someone may think it's a great idea, but they just may not have the resources to be able to pay. And so a lot of the models that we found that were being done for community solar require you to have cash flow. And if you don't have cash flow that you can apply to being part of it, that's a limiting factor. And so if you think about the beginning of community solar, it was a premium product. And so the people who could invest, whether it was on their rooftop or as a participant, as a subscriber to something that was off-site, you were willing to pay extra. And I think one of the challenges is if we try to look at this as a way to do cheaper electricity, it just doesn't bear out. It is not cheaper to actually have a small solar field on the edge of town is not the necessarily cheapest way to get electrons. Another factor that is key that Felicia's going to talk about a lot more is that there's a lack of structurally sound, affordable housing stock, and so that limits what people can do in their own communities. And so when we set up a framework for looking at this, that was one of the reasons why I'll talk a little more about why we set up with scale, looking at what the tiny house might be able to do for people who are who need sufficient self-sufficiency, but they don't have a roof over their head. A lot of the projects are either going for single family or neighborhoods targeted to specific neighborhoods. But again, it only addresses a certain portion. Multifamily, residential, and rooftop is very much oriented towards somebody who's already in a supported environment and is in a project development situation. And then if you're going to have local solar gardens, that's what people tend to think of as community solar or remote solar farms. And I think what we see is that no two communities are the same. There's a tremendous amount of interest, but the big problem is that even though regulators are proposing these and states are buying into them in certain situations, it's almost impossible to find project developers who are willing to finance these projects because the constituents, the subscribers are too high risk. And so unless there is a large portion of money to be able to fund these, it's not going to be possible for lower income people to participate. And I think that this ties into a lot of the conversations around the country about net metering and what is the value that we ascribe to the solar that's being generated at the same time of day when everything else is being is where there's an oversupply, and so that affects the economics. And so one of the things that I want us to talk about more today is not just the idea of people individually being tied to a particular project because that panel is their panel, but rather how might we fund things like energy savings accounts and things that allow, mechanisms that allow us to get the support and the participation of this for more people, and how does it affect the other benefits they receive? So if family A gets to be part of the community solar project and family B doesn't, does that change their other benefits that they receive? And one of the things that I just want to also point out from your comment about how many people have signed up, from other research I've done on low income for the Low Income Energy Issues Forum, what we found out is that there are more people who really are eligible for these programs that are actually signing up for them. So that 30% doesn't really cover everybody who might actually need it and be affected.
Well, good morning. I'm grateful to be in smoke-free Sacramento. And I want to thank, I know that there are at least a dozen people and probably many more in this room who helped shelter evacuees from the fires in Sonoma, Mendocino, and Napa. And so thank you so much for helping out with that. Sonoma Clean Power is a community choice program, and we serve 600,000 customers in 2 counties, Sonoma and Mendocino. And I think one of the things that is important to address today is why is community choice taking off so fast, and what does that mean for the electric market in California? And so just to recap, there were 3 community choice programs 2 years ago. There's 13 operating today. The utilities are forecasting that over half of all of their load will depart to community choice within just a couple of years. That's a very rapid shift, and it obviously leads to good questions about how do we make sure that shift is strong and helpful for the communities that we serve. And so one of the things that I want to reframe and dispel a myth is that there's been a mythology that community choice competes with investor-owned utilities, and we've been guilty of saying this ourselves. But the truth is, decoupling meant that financially, the utilities have guaranteed cost recovery. They aren't allowed to earn a profit off the sale of electricity. And so there isn't a competition between a community choice and a utility per se. There are more options and customer choices there, so perhaps that's the competition that could still exist. But really, the competition when a CCA forms is about getting into the market and having a public power advocate participating in the electric market in ways that the IOUs do not, fighting for lower prices without the baggage of a shareholder incentive and dividend that they have to care about, and essentially fighting for the customer and the ratepayer. And that competition is really about suppliers to the market. And so market participation with CCAs is vastly higher than with IOUs, who generally don't participate in the market. And the other reason, the other myth I want to dispel is that the benefits of the IOU activity, the utility activities in communities, goes away when a CCA forms. The utilities have showed up in our counties to replace poles. They were there, they set up emergency operation centers, they made donations. PG&E is all over this fire, and they did it in Lake County 2 years ago with the Valley Fire. They do it where they have customers. They continue to participate in the communities, and I want to thank the IBEW linemen who are out there right now. They don't change what they do in communities when a CCA forms. And so all of the efficiency programs, all of the customer programs, all of the rebates, all of the utility activities and work that they do continues. And so what a community choice program really does is it adds to that. It creates a finance vehicle that is in the control of the public that allows us to do economic development. And the next myth I want to dispel is that the primary value proposition of a community choice program is about cleaner, greener, and cheaper. Those are floors now. You have to do that, but that's not enough. You can't guarantee you're cheaper if you're a community choice program for many of the reasons that have already been mentioned. And with SB 100 coming, with many efforts at the state level, the argument that a CCA will forever be cleaner than a utility may not bear out over a 10-year period. And so, yes, I think we have to hold the bar up very high and be cleaner and greener and cheaper when we can. But the truth is, it's about economic development. So we're a pretty small region. We only have 600,000 people in our region, but we've managed to provide $100 million of rate relief in terms of reductions on bills to customers. We've invested tens of millions of dollars in our community, and we're preparing to invest $10 million or more in fire relief efforts as a direct response to this. None of that financing would have been available without a community choice program. So it's about that additionality, and what's great is we're working with PG&E to do that. So on our electric vehicle program, we've been able to negotiate really deep discounts on electric cars, and those incentives go directly to the customer as a discount off the cost of their car. It makes those electric vehicles cheaper than gas cars, and those incentives go disproportionately to care customers. And so we've managed to do that reach out. The awesome thing there is PG&E is all over this, and they're helping us coordinate about where charging infrastructure should go, and we're working together on this. So I think there's been this very loud concern about the end of utilities or other sort of dramatic things said, but the truth is a community choice program takes only retail generation, which the utilities can't earn a profit on, and which they don't own most of. They actually go out and buy through long-term PPAs and contracts. And it transfers that to the public. And so I think I want to start there and then get into some other issues next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me on the panel. I'd like to talk about the work that we're doing at UCLA, the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. We're focused on energy and water issues with a social equity lens. So we're very data-driven, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the questions that we ask about the data are informed by our concern for social equity and how benefits and uptake of various programs and sort of transitions are happening across the landscape and differentially in different communities with different levels of assets and resources. So right now we're working on one of our CEC funded grants is around advanced energy communities, and the focus is on disadvantaged communities defined by the CalEnviroscreen that you mentioned. And we're working with a team, including a community-based organization, which I can talk about later on in our panel. And it's a planning grant, and what we're trying to do is focus our design to support people who traditionally have not been involved in the energy transition, who have not had as much access to energy efficiency programs or solar. And our program or our design is focused on a community solar offering. And that's driven through both the demographics and the data that we're working with. And so this slide kind of summarizes that. So on the demographic side, we're looking to provide options for renters, multifamily, people who cannot afford solar on their own homes, or people whose roof may not be able to support a solar panel. And those are sort of the demographics that are more prevalent in the disadvantaged communities. But the other driver is the data. And the basis for the data analytics that we do is the UCLA Energy Atlas, which is kind of a unique database that takes the utility account level data that we have access to but are maintained within strict privacy regulations. And we match that to the attributes of the parcels that are associated with those accounts. And we're able to ask questions and reveal information about how energy use relates to building attributes, how old those buildings are, what the square footage is, a more detailed information about the use type. what census tracts they belong to in terms of population, in terms of income, and of course, CalEnviroscreen score as well. And I want to show an example of what we did for this pilot community that we're working in, which is a set of disadvantaged community tracts within the LA unincorporated areas. And what we did was we combined our information about energy usage in these buildings to the LA solar map, which is something that was created by the county a while back, that mapped out all the rooftops in the county and analyzed what the capacity was of those rooftops to produce solar based on their size, their angle, their orientation, all of that. And so we combined the usage data, or we compared the usage data to the solar potential of the rooftops. And what you can see from this 2x2 set of graphs, on the left-hand side, this is single-family parcels. On the right-hand side, it's multifamily. The graphs on the top look at electricity usage only, and the graphs at the bottom look at both electricity and the equivalent natural gas demand. And what they are histograms that compare the number of parcels in these census tracts. So we're looking at about 3,000 odd parcels. And the vertical line at 1 is the line at which your rooftop solar has a potential to fulfill all of that energy use, whether it be just your electrical, or in the bottom, whether it's your electrical and your natural gas demand. And what you can see is if you look at just electricity demand for single-family parcels in the upper left, there are, a substantial 58% going on, maybe 60% you can think of that can achieve this sort of zero net energy or zero net electricity status. But still the remaining 40 that don't have that capacity. But as you move to multifamily parcels, you see that only about 40% would have the potential for rooftop solar that could meet their electricity demand. And then as you think about both electricity and natural gas demand, so if you wanted to think about electrifying the natural gas appliances in these buildings, at a single family level, you could only get to about 14% NZE. And it's much worse at the multifamily level, where only 4% of the parcels could actually meet this demand. So this kind of detailed information that we're able to generate for this community that we're working in, I guess I'd say first that this is the type of information we need to inform specific designs that are appropriate for the specific communities. And the second takeaway is that these results are showing that you're not going to get there just by rooftop alone. So you really need community solar, and we really need to find a way to make this financially viable. So I can talk more about that as we move on.
Great, yes, and hoping to have more of a dialogue here, but one of the things that kind of cut across a lot of what you were discussing is, in general, we're seeing kind of two push points. One is distributed is not cheaper than wholesale, and distributed is better than rooftop, potentially, depending on how you optimize. And one of the exercises we're certainly going through, I think in multi-agencies here, certainly at the PUC and the CEC, is we're looking at what is that value for DG on the system. And I wonder if you could talk about, is there an optimization of that, for these communities as we look at the broader question of where is the value for DG in distribution, in wholesale?
So I'd argue that the reason to do community solar is not for the financial reasons, but because it's awareness. So when people see the generation, it's something that becomes real. It's like they don't know where that power plant is, what it looked like, whatever. But when they see this solar field, they say, okay, they kind of know what it is, it becomes real to them, they are more likely to get engaged. If they have a portion of that field then they have a dog in the hunt. They, now it's something like, how's my solar array doing? And so we saw this in Worcester, Massachusetts, where they had a school that had a pretty extensive solar array, and they had the performance in the lobby of the school, and the kids would come in and they could track it and they could see it and they could understand what it was, but to make it meaningful to the children, they made popcorn from a solar generated popcorn maker. So, I think the idea is the people in this room care about these things because it's your business, it's our business, it's what we spend all day doing, but it's not what other people spend all day doing. So you have to meet them with what they care about, okay? And I think that's where having community groups that have an interest in education or efficiency or energy literacy are important to get involved, because there has to be something that's meaningful to them. It's not what you do all day that's meaningful to them.
And I'm glad you brought up the schools, because that's one of the sectors that we're engaging with in our Advanced Energy Community Project, is working with the schools and our community partner, which is an organization called Day One that's been working in the San Gabriel Valley for 30 years or so, engaging on a whole series of different health and environmental issues. They're working with the local school district, and they're going to have the students there actually make a video that's related to energy and the types of energy-related sort of education and outreach that we've been doing as part of this planning phase. And the school is very interested in the tie-in between potential rooftop or car park panels, and how that helps them to engage the students and create a sort of a pipeline of education and job training opportunities through the elementary schools, the high schools, and also into the local community college system.
Yeah, and I just want to caution, I would be very careful to think that we know what's going to happen in 5 or more years. And I think that to try to say local distributed versus central is, I think, a false argument. I think the world is changing extremely fast. We've seen solar plus storage in large applications get close to parity and look like it's going to beat gas peakers pretty soon. But one of the things that I just want to talk about is we have tools now. So daytime electric vehicle charging revalues net metering. So do it. And what that means is putting electric vehicle charging where people park at work, and where they take transit, and where they get out of their cars. Coordinating distributed energy resources and managing that. So we're working with Olivine to set up tools so that we can coordinate dispatch across our entire territory and use that as a resource to soak up solar and put it to a high value instead of curtailing it. Community storage, not just community solar. We have these tools now, and yes, some of them are still pretty nascent. Storage is still a pretty new technology, and not a lot of us have used very much of it yet. But that world is changing incredibly fast. And so I think to bet against rooftop solar is a bad bet. I think rooftop solar has got a future.
Yeah, so I'm not saying it doesn't have a future, but it's about distributed investment. So if I choose to put a solar array on my house, I'm the person responsible, I'm the one who gets the primary benefit, but it doesn't do anything for my neighbor. And I think the idea to assume that economies of scale are going to go away in this industry doesn't make sense to me.
So I agree. And one of the things I've been telling our own local solar industry is the closer you get to selling at wholesale and buying at retail, the stronger your business model looks. Because if you can figure that out, you don't need net metering. And you can be a real market participant. And solar isn't all that crazy far away from that. And so I just want to challenge this idea that you can create microgrids in your house. There are tools to do that, and we can certainly do it in communities. So passing the meter isn't a magical thing. There was a bill that failed in this last session to look at whether or not the full transmission access charge should be charged to net metered energy. And I think there's an argument that some of that is probably reasonable, some reduction. The question is, and I think it's a question of the ISO, is how much? And I think if we tackle these kind of issues, solar is not the answer. We need a lot more wind. We need geo and biomass, and we need other technologies for sure. But the fact that we've got technologies now, that Nest thermostats help balance the system in Hawaii, that we've got electric cars that we know how to regulate how fast they charge, not just through curtailing how fast they're charging, but ramping them up. We know how to charge cars at 80% of maximum normally, and then ramp up. So we have a reg up, reg down system that we know how to deploy now. We're going to put it in place in November and start using it with 900 electric chargers that we gave away to our customers so far. And we have all these tools. So let's use the solar to a practical purpose,
but what's
right?
going to happen when your customer who needs to go visit, that has an emergency trip because their mother fell and broke their hip, and their car has been used as a battery, and they can't get there because they don't have the full charge on their car? I mean, I think that...
I'm a skeptic of vehicle to grid. Taking energy out of a car battery is not yet a good idea, in my opinion. And you don't need to, because you can regulate how fast that car charges up and down, and what that means is you can simulate vehicle to grid. Once you have about 50,000 cars in our region doing that, there's no added value for vehicle to grid. We've modeled this out. There's no extra value because you have a resource you can regulate up and down just like vehicle to grid would do. So I think it's important to be skeptical of the complicated solutions like having an interconnect agreement at your house for an electric car without having a solar array. Oh my God. So I think we can get around that with technology that costs $500 today and manage that with telemetry. We have the systems. There are many vendors who sell this technology now. Let's use it.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick point that I wasn't advocating that all the solar needs to be community solar. I was just trying to illustrate that you can't get there on rooftop alone, but there is definitely still a place for rooftop, and perhaps some community members that think they can't afford it might be able to afford it with some of the good programs that are out there for financing, and I think that that speaks to the need to build the capacity of community organizations around energy issues so that you can have a trusted source of information in the community that's providing this information and this guidance to the community members, because there's a lot of suspicion and a lot of news out there about sort of profit-driven activities that have signed people up for programs that they then couldn't afford and that weren't appropriate for them. So the folks in the community, everybody, not just disadvantaged communities for sure, but for people who generally don't spend a lot of time, thinking and reading about these, who are busy with their own lives, they need to be able to rely on someone to have a trusted source of information. And what we found when we were looking for a community organization is that there weren't a lot of community-based organizations that really had this knowledge around energy issues. And we are happy about the fact that one of the benefits of the project that we're doing is to build the capacity of this organization we're working with, and then they can, they can go out and do other work around energy-related issues.
Well, that's a great point in terms of having these communities have some capacity to even know what they would like to see. You've talked about optimizing in terms of capacity of solar, in terms of where your electric vehicle infrastructure might be. There's different ways to optimize the location of these distributed resources and the practicality of having folks with capacity on the ground. Whose responsibility is it to build that capacity, and how do you pay for that?
So I think that we have to look at some different models than the way we've been doing it. So to take your car charging example. So if you have a solar canopy that can have car charging where people are coming to work, and you also make it available overnight so that low-income consumers can maybe do a car sharing model where they can get EVs, because one of the problems for low-income consumers is getting to their jobs. And the buses aren't always running efficiently, and so it takes a really long time. So if you can look at these things in different ways, okay, then maybe you can sort of take it to another level. Now, I think that the issue of who pays for it, I think one of the things that we have to be mindful of is we have to look for multiple players who have a vested interest. So we're in a society now where we have huge parts of the country who don't want to support programs for low-income people, who don't want to share their wealth, okay? And it's fine for affluent people who can buy the stuff for themselves, but I'm not seeing where there's the people standing up and saying, I'll pay for it for somebody else. And because we mandate the investor-owned utilities to be able to take care of these folks, they have some skin in the game to do it. But I think that's one of the challenges that you have as a regulator is who are you going to get to do it? So I think if you look at combining, if the vehicle manufacturer who might sell the car to that model, if you look at the program that, whether it's Lyft or somebody else, but somebody who does the car sharing service, the Zip car, that they can come up with a model that makes sense, so that then you get leverage from what somebody is investing because they have a reason to support it. But I think we have to break the things apart to look at them differently in order to come up with, it's not just at your house and then you go off to work.
I was going to just jump in on your question about who should pay for building this capacity. And I'm not sure, but I can say that currently there are quite a few barriers to community organizations accessing funding that's available through certain state agencies. And there are many funding opportunities that come out that require you to have a community partner and to be working within disadvantaged communities. And yet the level of complexity that's involved in applying for and getting one of these grants is enormous. And it's really the type of thing that you need to have a sort of a grant writing machine in-house like universities do or large consulting companies do that are familiar with all of these, because if you give this to a community organization that just has a few people, they're completely overwhelmed with it. They have no experience, they don't understand the jargon, and just the amount of time that you have to invest. And you have to have those extra resources in-house to spend the time doing that. And so I think the barrier is too high for a lot of these grants, despite the fact that they're paying sort of lip service to wanting the community organizations involved. The reality, the logistics are a barrier.
So here's an example of I think the short answer to your question is everyone is responsible for serving the community. I mean, the real way to ask it is who isn't. But as an example, given all these fires, one of the things Sonoma Clean Power is doing is we're trying to come up with a outline plan of how we could get a dozen or so standard models of homes that could be built very quickly to replace the 5,000 structures we're going to need in the next couple of years that are fossil-free, no gas, that are extremely energy efficient, that have solar built in, that have electric vehicle charging capacity built in, that are possible to integrate together and integrate with community solar systems. So you don't necessarily have to have solar on every single roof, but you can distribute it where it makes sense. And to simplify the process, because we have, in just one neighborhood, we have 900 homeowners with no HOA, no governing organizations that own 900 separate parcels in one neighborhood that all lost their homes. That's 900 separate construction projects that have to happen in one neighborhood. They need an incredibly simple process. So one of the things that we're trying to design is, what is that incredibly simple process? You come here, you have a public agent looking out for your back, partnering with the utilities, with the county, with your city, and making sure that you get the right things done on your insurance claims and so forth. And that idea emerged yesterday. So I think one of the points I want to make is we are nimble. We've been trying to whiteboard out what we can do, and that idea isn't even baked yet. But I can tell you that everybody who's heard it says, yeah, that sounds right. We need to do this. And so I think that excitement of being able to add to all those linemen who are putting up poles and all the donations that are happening and create a resource is part of the value of public entities serving electricity.
But I don't think everybody wants to be in a cookie cutter house. And I think that if you look at a program like
It would definitely be optional.
the community, so you look at the community-based organization program that they did at San Diego Gas and Electric, and they did a great thing. So what they did was they started out, they began this program, this partner program, when they were doing their AMI rollout. And they first reached out to the
Do you want to
environment.
explain a little bit what AMI is?
I'm sorry, advanced metering infrastructure. So the technology, the digital technology out on the distribution side. And so you probably, a couple of you heard about smart meter protests. Maybe that sort of entered your consciousness. But the thing was that what they did at San Diego was they started with the environmental groups who already had and they used them as ambassadors. And they didn't just ask them to teach energy literacy for the sake of it, they gave them money to support what you're talking about. So they made them write a small grant, they brought them in for a training workshop to learn how to write a grant, they gave them some money to support what they were doing. Then they started expanding it, and every year they'd expand it more. So when they'd go into the Vietnamese community, they'd go in through a Vietnamese organization. Now, not everybody there is low income. There were different reasons that people are involved. They went after business groups. And so in a diverse place like San Diego, they've been able to reach out to lots of different organizations to be ambassadors for other things. But I think it is and I'm totally, so I am totally supportive and jazzed about the idea of
I don't think we're disagreeing on anything.
Of having houses that can be built. But I think that it's got to be in a way that allows for the variability of human beings. That is part of who they are.
I'm in.
Okay, good.
Felicia, did you want to add to that point?
I'm not sure I wanted to, I don't necessarily have a strong opinion about the cookie cutter homes or not, but I do want to kind of go back to the CalEnviroscreen thing and mention, because we were talking before we came out, just among ourselves, about this idea of California in the CalEnviroscreen score being a combination of demographics on the one side that relate to income, that relate to poverty levels, that type of thing. And on the other side, the pollution burden side of it, right? That score, to what extent are these communities impacted by air pollution, water pollution, hazardous waste sites, that type of thing. And I think that's really important that both of those are being put together because we're getting to not just people who can't afford or don't have the resources to take these steps themselves to maybe upgrade their home with energy efficiency, make their indoor air quality better, but the ones that have been most impacted by, let's face it, the fossil fuel energy generation economy, right? And so this is how you pull in that side, the people who have been impacted, whose health has been impacted, whose children have been impacted, and focusing on these communities for investments or preferential investments in energy efficiency or access to solar. And I want to emphasize or illustrate that by just highlighting another finding that has come out of the Energy Atlas analytics that we've done. We found that over the years, of course, with Title 24 and increases in energy efficiency requirements for new buildings have gotten certainly much more energy efficient. And when you look at certain neighborhoods, you'll see that there's a high percentage of new buildings that are very energy efficient, so low energy usage per square foot. But the problem is that when you look at the energy uses on a per capita basis, they're enormous. 10 more even times what you're seeing in these communities, these lower income communities. So South LA, East LA, San Gabriel Valley, older homes that are very porous, they're very energy inefficient. So when you look at the energy use per square foot, they're terrible. But when you look at the energy use per capita, they're very low. And also, if you look over time at the changing profile of, or size distribution of new homes, it's grown very significantly. And that growth has actually offset some of the savings that you would have gotten from the energy efficiency regulations that are prescribed under Title 24. And so that's another, just sort of a backdrop or context for what we're talking about.
So Jeff should make the houses really small, is that what you're saying? Cookie cutter should be small.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I want to highlight is Lancaster, who has 46% care customers, stood up a community choice program a couple of years ago and just recently reached out to Pico Rivera and Apple Valley to help them set up their programs. And that model is unbelievable. It's about communities helping communities who have similar problems and challenges. And the risk, of course, I think many of you in the room have heard the rumor that CCAs aren't paying our fair share. And the risk is that that rumor gets legs because the utilities haven't been willing to go through an audit. They haven't been willing to show any of their data. They haven't been willing to prove any of these claims. And I think we're at this point where the CPUC is now taking up that matter. And I think we're going to get to see the data. But I think the more important point is we need to protect all customers because right now, I know about PG&E, I don't know about Edison, but PG&E has caused well over $1 billion of cost to all ratepayers by mismanaging their portfolio, by not selling off long positions and sleeving it out when they had way too much energy, and by withholding energy essentially and not managing that appropriately, selling it in the spot market at the lowest value with no hedging value and no other value. And that's a problem because all customers are paying for that. That's an increase in everyone's rates, whether you're community choice or bundled or anyone else. In our territory alone, it's several $100 million. And that's a serious problem. And so that needs to be fixed quickly, and it can be before LA launches, because this is going to be a much bigger problem.
Stay on topic, Jeff. Stay on topic.
Okay. So Jeff, so what do you do? So you're saying, yeah, and anybody who knows me knows that I have really discussed with utilities better ways that I think they could offer customer choice, and I come out of the computer industry, and so because I come out of the computer industry, I don't believe that computers are the solution to everything. And to anybody here who's never had their computer crash at an inopportune time, please raise your hand, okay? So I think that, and see nobody's hands. And so I just think that this is a very complicated problem with a lot of issues. So one of the questions I have for you is, okay, one of the challenges that utilities all over the country are having is that people are in situations where they can't afford to pay their bills, okay? And yet they have to maintain service, moratoriums, winter moratoriums, summer moratoriums. So what do CCAs do when people can't pay their bills for an extended period of time? Are you gonna carry them?
Well, actually, there are rules that stipulate what we can do. So one of the things that our governing board gets to decide is how long a time period do we let go by before a collection process is initiated. And so, for example, following the fires, we've suspended that process until we can figure out what the heck's going on. But normally it's 90 or 120 days, depending on the customer type, and then they get a notice, and then there's a collections process that gets initiated. The rules currently say that we have to return a customer that's non-paying to the utility because only a utility has the power to turn off energy to a customer, and not a CCA. And that's because the utility is liable for the safety of line workers and the safety of turning power on and off.
So you're not doing the heavy lifting?
Not doing what?
The heavy lifting of that?
We're not allowed to. So change the rules and make us provider of last resort, and all of a sudden we'll solve the problem, won't we?
So there's a couple of things that overlap here, going back to what Felicia was mentioning on the EnviroScreen, and even the issue of disconnections, frankly. If we look at the state, we have pockets of aggrieved energy burden, aggrieved pollution. And some of them do overlap with CCA territories, and some of them overlap extremely with IOU territories. And this goes to the question of how we pay for this. Certainly, your discretion and flexibility in the CCA realm is really tied to the generation side. And my question is, do you think that more of these investments should take place by paying for them on the distribution side, which will bear a higher cost across all customers, at least within the IOU territories.
So currently, Community Choice is responsible for nearly all reliability obligations for its customers. So all resource adequacy of all types, long-term contracting, now portfolio diversity, that's a newer element, which is good, thank you. And so a lot of what is really between the gaps is legislatively mandated items that come up on an urgency basis have, over the last couple of years, like the biomass mandate, was given to the utilities alone as a reliability mandate, and then those costs were passed on to Community Choice customers. Community Choice unilaterally wants those mandates to come to us. We want to be told when there's a reliability requirement, we want the right to self-procure. Right now we have a legal responsibility to self-procure, and we want that right to continue and go to all reliability elements that are possible. So Dave Olson, the governor, this morning asked, how do large-scale projects get built? And this is part of the same question. CalCCA, the Trade Association of Community Choice Programs, is setting up a process where we can jointly procure and jointly own assets, much like the munis do today. And that's a good solution. There was another question about, does the state need to step in and, provide credit to buy that? And the truth is the state does that now. The utilities have state-backed credit through AB 57 that guarantees cost recovery and set up the exit fees. And so that is a good question to ask, and I think it's something that if the utilities actually start to make an exit out of retail generation altogether, which is where I think things are going, then I think that question has to get answered well in advance, and we need to figure that out.
But I think you're down to, it's either got to be the customers paying for it, no matter how it's managed, the taxpayers paying for it, a business paying for it out of profits and revenues, or a charitable function. And I think that you really have to look at these things because somebody's going to pay. So one of the things that we were prepping for this panel, we were talking about the environmental justice issue, and our panelist who wasn't able to be here was saying, well, it's important to do this because, it's the right thing to do, and it is, and I'm not arguing with that. But the reason why these projects aren't getting funded is because the financial institutions who expect a return on their money need to get a return on their money, and there's too high a risk if people have trouble paying because they don't have money in their bank accounts or jobs that are high enough to pay. So I think we really have to look at this, is that if we're going to take this as a public benefit and a public good, that we can't just say, oh, well, the PG&E shareholders are the ultimate piggy bank for everything, or, we have to, as citizens, own up and pay for it and be willing to do that. And I think that it's easy to sort of talk about these things in the abstract, but somebody at the end of the day has to pay for it. Now, I think that one of the things that I wanted to ask Felicia about was the idea of, have you looked at the benefit of home energy retrofits and things that are weatherization programs that may have more job opportunities for the same community so that you could get some economic value happening that way? Because I think there needs to be, again, it can't just be the classic model. We have to look at different sources for revenue. And so I think from your perspective is you've got to be able to authorize things that are more complicated that way.
Right, that's a good question. We've definitely been thinking about the sort of the community-based benefits associated with different aspects of our project. And for the retrofits, there's definitely an in-community job component to that. But it's interesting that you brought up the question of energy efficiency, because when you think about benefits, again, this is an issue that really needs to be data-driven, and we're currently digging into analyzing exactly how have these energy efficiency upgrades really changed energy usage. And you can only do that by, really get an answer by using actual data, usage data. So we're in the middle of doing an energy efficiency effectiveness analysis using actual energy data. And we're still refining the model results, but I can say that just in support of, I guess, what we already know, which is that the penetration into disadvantaged communities is much lower than it is, the uptake of these energy efficiency rebates and other programs that the utilities offer is about half as much in the lower income areas as it is on average overall. But the other element of that I wanted to mention is just this whole issue with, is it cost effective, or can you make the financing case? For us right now, it's extremely uncertain. We've got the LACCE, which is just being developed, but we also have this unresolved issue of the PCIA charges, and we also have this looming time of use rate change. And so it's a shifting landscape, and it's very, very hard to pin things down and to understand, or calculate, what will this cost, and what do we need? So right now we're just trying to wrestle with that uncertainty and that inability to really pin things down. But I do think that overall, when getting back to the issue of the pollution burden, perhaps more of it needs, perhaps a higher percentage of the greenhouse gas funds should be allocated to investments in disadvantaged communities.
One quick comment. One of the programs, we run all these programs, and then at the end of the year we evaluate them and decide to kill most of them, even if they're good, and then we invest in the really killer one. And one of the ones that absolutely blew me away was the cheapest program we've ever launched. It's called the DIY Toolkit, and we put toolboxes in every public library. They are disproportionately checked out by care customers, and there's a guide. There's equipment to retrofit your own home. There's information about how to go further. And what's wild is they are the most checked out item in our public library system. And it is the cheapest thing we've ever done. So here's to experimenting, because we didn't know that in advance. We thought, we'll put $20,000 into a program. And all of a sudden it just took off. And so I think that's a great idea.
I'll be in touch with you about that.
I'm going to let you wrap up with this final question. It's on that innovation, and we've often been critiqued, probably rightfully so, for not allowing the IOUs to be more nimble and creative. And this area in particular is an example of that. Do you feel that there is a better provider of these innovative solutions for disadvantaged communities?
So I'm not sure that I would ask the question that way. I mean, I think that the PUC ought to allow more innovation at the utilities that you govern. I think that I think there's more innovation that could come out of the utilities who have the resources and the scale to be able to do it. I mean, I love this program. I think this sounds fabulous. But when I've worked with utilities who have done some really innovative things, and they have to be willing to do it without cost recovery, and not all utilities will do that. And some of them will say, well, our hands are tied, our commission won't let us. And so I think this is one of the things where regulators need to change position and allow there to be prototyping. So again, what came out of Silicon Valley, what came out of, I was at Apple in the early days and worked with SGI and so when we were doing things that no one had ever done it before, but they'd give you a few $100,000 and let you try it. And I think that, and some of them worked and some of them didn't work, but there was the way for experimentation. And it doesn't have to be done in an irresponsible way, but you have to be able to prototype and try these things and not call them pilots, which have all sorts of other infrastructure and reporting around them.
I'll just say one thing so that you can have the last word appropriately on this question. But I'll just add that wherever it comes from, we need good data. We need real data. And we need to make sure that data continues to be available from the CCAs the same way it is from the utilities, because that's going to be key to understanding the real effect of these programs.
Let me build on that, because one of my pet peeves is, as a state, we tend to legislate and regulate proximate goals. We regulate energy use per square foot in Title 24. We regulate emissions per something, per capita, per car, per miles per gallon. Those aren't goals. Goals are absolute goals. Goals are safety, affordability, reliability, zero carbon. Those are goals. And what I would say is allow innovation and tie the compensation to absolute results, not proximate results, not how efficient something was, what the actual result was. What got emitted? Was it cheaper? Was it safe? Was it reliable? That's what matters. And if we build programs on that basis, then we'll actually start getting the results. Because I think a lot of what has been the challenge of our efficiency programs is the more houses you touch in a retrofit, the more compensation you get. And that's bullshit. I mean, we have to change that. What if you're touching houses and making them worse? And I'm not saying the programs do, but I am saying the programs have some mixed results, and there are some programs that should not have been compensated. So I think if we keep our eye on absolute results, we're going to get further a lot faster. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank you all for being here and thank the audience for waiting it out.